Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. Now, one of the things that I'm always obsessed about when I'm out shooting on the street is sharpness. I'm always trying to make sure that I'm using a fast enough shutter speed so that as I'm photographing things on the street, especially people who are moving really quickly across the scene, that my shutter speed is fast enough that I get a tack sharp photograph. But every once in a while, I'll take a look at a picture where people have used panning and blur to create really interesting images. And I like being reminded that I don't always have to try to get everything sharp. Sometimes I will use a slow shutter speed to affect blur, but panning is the technique in which you follow the subject as they are moving, which keeps them relatively sharp, but blurs the background. So I thought I'd use a couple examples from images submitted into the Flickr poll to show what I'm talking about. Okay, let's start with this picture submitted by Brendon. It was shot with a Nikon D7000 at 1/30th of a second at f/16 at ISO 800. Now this is a great example of a panning shot. And for people who aren't familiar with what panning is, it's the technique where you are following your subject with the camera and you're actually moving the camera from left to right or right to left, but you're keeping pace with your subject. And you're using a relatively slow shutter speed, maybe a 60th of a second, a 30th, or a 15th. And you're keeping pace with them as they're moving through the scene. And because you're keeping the camera focused on them, they appear relatively sharp. But everything else in the frame, especially the things in the background, are rendered in a blur. Now, it's not just about shutter speed. There are a lot of other factors, including focal length, subject to camera distance, how fast the subject is moving through the scene that you have to consider. But suffice it to say that when you're doing it right, you can make some really remarkable shots where the subject is really tack sharp or relatively sharp, but the background becomes this wash of color and line and texture. And this shot, I think, is great. I love the inclusion of the arrow at the bottom of the frame. I think the colors in behind the scooter here is just fantastic. He's practicing really good technique in terms of panning it from left to right. And I'll include a link to a video that describes how to properly pan, because it's not so much about camera settings as it is your technique. Because just like when you're swinging with a bat, it's really important to have follow through. When it comes to panning, you have to do the very same thing when you're panning with the camera. So unfortunately, I don't have the opportunity to demonstrate technique to you right here, but I'll include a link to a video where I think they teach you how to effectively pan. And it's going to take a lot of practice if you're not familiar with it, but you can get a really interesting result. And it's important to throw something in the mix, to not just always shoot the same way, not always pursue the ultra sharp photograph where everything is tack sharp in the frame, because sometimes you can get really interesting photographs like this. Now here's another shot by Bob McClure. We don't have any XF information here. Here we have what are, I assume, cheerleaders for the Arizona Cardinals. And they're walking down the street, and Bob catches them and makes this really lovely shot of this woman walking past him on the sidewalk. And she is tack sharp. I mean, when you take a look at the pictures, you can see her eyes and her hand are razor sharp. But as you start moving away from her face, you can see everything else starts to get blurry. Even the satchel she's carrying over her shoulder, her skirt, the other ladies in the background, all of them are blurred. And if you take a look at the background, at the skyscrapers or the apartments in the back, they're all blurred. And she's relatively sharp, which can be really hard to do when you're panning, but it's, Bob here just nailed it. Because that's ideally what you want to have. You want to have your subject as sharp as possible and have everything else blurred. Now, when you're working really closely to your subject, you have to be moving your camera that much faster than a subject who is a distance away. So it can be even harder to be able to nail sharpness at a relatively slow shutter speed as the subject is moving and you're practicing your panning technique. But I love how well Bob did it here. And I think the overall composition is just great. You have these women's faces in the background, all smiling. But this woman in the front just radiates, and we just gravitate to her because not only is she in the center of the frame, but if you take a look at her face and her hand, she is really the brightest element in the frame. And Bob here may have applied some dodging and burning in order to bring her out. But that's fine by me because it helps keep the focus on her. And one of the other things that I really like about this shot is the gesture of her hand holding her sash in place. You can see that the other woman to her right is doing the very same thing. So I suspect that if that those sashes may have not been pinned to their shoulders, or they were slipping, even if they were pinned. So I suspect that that's why they were both doing it, as they're moving what looks like briskly down the street. But it's the combination of the brightness, her expression, the gesture of her hand, all of which makes for a really interesting and a lovely photograph. Here's another shot by Wallace Rollins, shot with a Fuji. I'm not sure exactly which model this is. It looks like an S5700 or S700. And this was shot at 105th of a second at f3.5 at ISO 64. So here we have this girl just running through the scene, and again Wallace manages to capture a really sharp image of the girl, and the background is slightly blurred. It's not as blurred as the first shot. Part of the reason for that is that she's probably not moving as quickly through the frame as the person on the scooter was. So even though they were panning the same from left to right, the speed of the subject often dictates how much blur you're going to get, especially if you're using the same shutter speed as the person who was on the scooter. If you wanted to affect more blur in this particular case, you would have to use an even slower shutter speed. But the risk there is it's so slow that your subject is rendered slightly out of focus or slightly blurred, because it's just that much harder to keep the camera steady enough to keep them relatively sharp. And you'll have to play around as you start panning with different subject matter, whether it's someone on a horse or children at play or people on a motorcycle, on a bicycle. You'll have to experiment, and as you shoot more and more, you'll kind of determine what is your sweet spot in terms of shutter speed. And I recommend, if you're starting to practice this technique, practice it with a particular lens in mind, because your choice of focal length is going to make a huge difference in terms of your shutter speed and how you manage the camera as you're panning left to right or right to left. When I look at the shot, there's so much to like. I mean, she's the brightest element in the frame. The gesture of her legs and her arms is just fantastic. We've got this expression. The tones for the background are a little darker than her and the rest of the frame, but offer a really nice counterpoint. And she's perfectly placed in the frame using the rule of thirds here, and that works really, really nicely. So everything in the shot works beautifully, and the fact that Wallace here was panning, I think, makes it for a much more interesting shot than if it was a shot at a faster shutter speed where everything was tack sharp. I like shots like these because they remind me that there are always different choices that I can make. I can get very different photographs if I just think a little outside the box and decide to do something different from my norm. So I hope that you found this interesting, as usual. And if you would like to submit images to our Flickr group, please go to the Candid Frame on Flickr, ask to be added, and I'll be glad to do so. We have thousands and thousands of people submitting their images on a weekly basis, and I'm really enjoying taking a look at your photographs and growing a nice community here. And for those who are interested in learning more about photography and their cameras and how to make better photographs, I'm offering the Candid Frame Photo Essentials ebook and video workshop for just $49. It includes a 59 full-color ebook and 3 hours of streaming video lectures in which I talk about exposures, the difference between RAW and JPEG, white balance, focus. A lot of the things that I talk about in this video, you'll find answered in this essential book, and it's just $49. I think it's some great content at a really great price, and you can just visit by just going to the candidframestore.com, or you'll find the link below in the show notes. And if you want to see some of the photography that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, you can follow me on Instagram and just do a search on my name, Ibarionex, and you'll find me there. And if this is the first time that you've heard of the Candid Frame, you don't want to miss our podcast, the Candid Frame Podcast, which you can find at thecandidframe.com, where I feature conversations with some of the world's best established and emerging photographers. And you can find us at thecandidframe.com. And if you like these videos, please remember to subscribe and spread the word. All right. Thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next time.